مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. ماذا يحدث في السعودية؟ أكبر مصدر للنفط في العالم وواحدة من أهم حلفاء أمريكا. طوال عقود أن الاستقرار في السعودية وحدة الأسرة الملكية والتحالف مع المؤسسة الدينية وتقسيم قوة الجيش بين فروع عديدة من الأسرة بحيث لا يصير فرع واحد أقوى من اللازم. بسلسلة من تحركات السرية للملك سلمان وابنه ولي العهد الأمير محمد تغير كل ذلك. السلطة الآن مركزة لا مقسمة، والمعركة ضد الفساد سقط أمراء بين الضحاياها، وروح الانفتاح الجديدة خلفت الزعماء الدينيين يحكون رؤوسهم من الهيرة. ماذا يعني كل هذا التغيير للمملكة؟ وماذا يعني للدور السعودية في المنطقة؟ وماذا يعني لمنافسة الرياض مع إيران؟ وماذا يعني لعلاقة أمريكا بالسعودية؟ لمناقشة رياح التغيير في السعودية يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينس وخوان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhil Washington. Today we're talking about U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia. There's a country that has made remarkable news in recent weeks, changes of the sort one would never imagine in the Desert Kingdom. And I'm delighted to have two guests today who have extensive experience working in and on Saudi Arabia to help explain what is going on and what it means for American interests more broadly in the Middle East. So, gentlemen, what is going on in this place where news is rarely made, but yet we've seen such dramatic change in just the last few weeks? Dennis, want to start?
You know, I was there last year and met the now Crown Prince. One of the ministers that I met separately said, "Welcome to our revolution disguised as economic reform." I think we're seeing what is a revolution from above. Unlike the so-called Arab Spring, where it was really from the squares, not from the palaces, this is coming actually from the palace. What we heard from him last year and what we've seen consistently is that he wants to remake the economy, but realizes to remake the economy there has to be a social change as well. And the social change has to extend to some of the power, some of the key constituencies that have been the power brokers in that society, in that polity. So it means taking on the religious establishment. It means also taking on an important part of the royal family that has benefited from the system as it was. So what I see going on is clearly an effort to transform the society, to, in a sense, aggregate all the instrumentalities of power in the Crown Prince's hands to ensure that he can overcome any opposition and to send the message that opposition to the reforms and to him is futile. So that's what I fundamentally see is going on, and I think we're going to continue to see what are significant steps that he takes. The real question is every step that he takes, is it one that reflects not just on the inside but also on the outside? Does it reflect the kind of consideration of the first, second, and third order consequences of what he's doing?
Okay, we'll get to foreign policy in a minute, but let's just focus for a minute on the, first on the domestic changes that are going on. Dennis referred to this as a revolution from the top. Of course, this is a revolution not to change the regime, but to protect the regime. Is that going to succeed?
Well, it is a bit of a palace coup of the regime itself, the way Saudi Arabia has operated with a consolidation of power around MBS and the king, and there's no question.
MBS being the Crown Prince.
The Crown Prince, excuse me, and so there's no question that that's happening. I think the real issue for the Crown Prince and the king is whether or not they can take these reforms in stages, or whether or not they actually have to break the system in order to actually have these reforms take hold. The challenge here is, are they taking on too much all at once, taking on the religious establishment with liberalization, for example, toward women? Are they taking on too much with the other royals? Certainly with the anti-corruption crackdown, the quasi-prison status in the Ritz-Carlton, negotiating the return of potentially billions of dollars back into state coffers. Are they then able to consolidate politically around the key ministries in the key provinces, especially near Riyadh? And so all of that is happening at once. And the question is it too much? Is it too much to actually break the system? And is this going to create antibodies within the royal family, antibodies internally that doesn't allow him to do this? All the while, and maybe this segues, Rob, to the foreign policy, all the while with a foreign policy that is much more aggressive, much more willing to take on Iran in the various proxy battles, where Saudi Arabia now sees itself as leading the charge against Iran, not simply being a part of the dynamic in Lebanon and Yemen most egregiously.
So let me ask you both about a fundamental aspect of the change going on. Let's put aside the anti-corruption issue for a minute, but the basic idea that the leadership wants to transform the world's largest exporter of oil into, at the very least, a much more diversified country, and perhaps even a country that doesn't rely exclusively or nearly as much on oil. Is that possible when you look at Saudi Arabia? What do you think?
Well, that's actually been the hope and dream, not just of this leadership, but past leadership, right? They have seen the example of other successful countries and jurisdictions around the world, even nearby Dubai, right, where diversification has been a singular part of the economic transformation and growth of that economy. And so the hope has been, can you diversify from oil and gas? Can you modernize in a way that attracts more investment? This has led to the idea of the public offering for Saudi Aramco, the oil giant. So there is a fundamental question. The underlying concern, though, is what is the attractiveness, what is the capacity, and what is the diversity that we're talking about? And I think one of the questions that emerges from all of the political tumult of the time is whether or not what's happening actually detracts, at least in the short term, from the attractiveness of that model. Will it deter foreign investors from being aggressive about coming in and investing in universities or in manufacturing or in high-tech ventures of the type that the Crown Prince and the King want? So all of this is a delicate balance with a lot of different factors at play, but this has been the golden fleece for Saudi Arabia for some time. Can you diversify the economy? Can you modernize it? And frankly, can you bring the Saudi people along with the capacities to actually meet the demands of a 21st century economy? That's still in question.
Dennis, what's your view?
You know, my view is that given the scope of the challenge that Juan just outlined, I'm not sure that you can do this incrementally. I'm not sure that, in fact, when you have to take on so many inherent impediments to real modernization there, the education system has to change, the social realities have to change, the work ethic and mindset has to change. It's a political culture that is being transformed in the service of being able to diversify the way Juan said, which is quite clearly what the King and the Crown Prince's objectives, I think, are in fact, those are the things that are shaping them. Now, given all that, is it possible to do it step by step? There is an inherent risk in trying to do too much too soon, no question. But it's also likely that if you move so incrementally, basically the time stretches out, the opposition can still build up because you can't show enough payoff soon enough. And the kind of, in some ways, the almost shock treatment that is required, I think doesn't take hold. One other point here. I think the Crown Prince, in particular, reads the mood of the Saudi public pretty well. You know, 2/3 of that public is under the age of 30. And I think the anti-corruption approach, the anti-corruption policy right now is extremely popular. I think there was built-up resentment about how much the royal family had, and in a sense, the limitation on what was possible for everyone else. one of the things I think that you see the Crown Prince trying to do, he's trying to show young people in Saudi Arabia you can have a dream and you can act on it. When I was there last year and went to the College of Entrepreneurship in King Abdullah City, what I was struck by is first the students were co-ed, half and half.
Co-ed meaning men and women studying together.
Half and half. And they were unbelievably enthusiastic. They were saying, you know, this is our chance to shape our country. So there is a spirit there that I think the Crown Prince and the King both sort of understood was latent, but also something that they're trying to capture. And the question still becomes, can they have enough early signs of success that it builds a kind of continuing confidence on the path they're on? I think in many ways that's the biggest challenge they face.
Okay,
I think Dennis is right on and brilliant as usual. The paradigm here is it's a little bit of shock and awe in terms of the reform in order to get to where they want to go, or can you do it incrementally? They're moving in the shock and awe mode currently, and certainly that in the foreign policy domain. But on the anti-corruption side, this is really a savvy move on the part of the Crown Prince, because it not only is popular internally, but it forces a restructuring of how the economy actually works. Yeah. How are we going to operate potentially with Western global standards, with transparency and accountability, if you have a system where the royals are in the pole position of controlling the economy, demanding of contracts, where there's in essence a monopoly on key infrastructure projects, et cetera. There is a shock and awe to the economy itself if you break that system. And then internationally, he inoculates himself a bit by couching all of what he's doing, at least currently with this portion of the reform, in anti-corruption terms. Because internationally now, there is much more attention to anti-corruption efforts, whether you look at the Lava Jato case in Brazil, or the scandals in Pakistan and India, or scandals in South Korea or Japan, or even the release of these Paradise Papers and Panama Papers. Right. There's an acute sensitivity to high levels of corruption and kleptocracy. And so in some ways he's brilliantly inoculated some of what he's doing, because at least the mantra of anti-corruption is acceptable internationally, and you can't argue that the society should be less corrupt.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to take an expanded look at change in Saudi Arabia, not just inside the country, but what the regime is doing to be a muscular, forceful leader around the region. Terms also not historically used in this context, and its impact on American interests in the Middle East. In just a moment. Again, my colleagues today include Dennis Ross. Dennis is counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis has 25 years' experience at high levels in government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the president's special envoy for Middle East peace. Sitting to his left is Juan Zerate. Juan is one of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts. He is the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, the senior national security analyst for NBC News, and a visiting lecturer of law at the Harvard Law School. Normally one wouldn't think of words like risk-taker, muscular, forceful, active to describe Saudi foreign policy. And normally, when countries go through major domestic change, they often take a time out from foreign policy. Well, that's not happening in this case. At the same time as all this is going on at home, the Saudis are pretty active abroad. Dennis, this is an unusual moment.
It is an unusual moment, but then I think we have an unusual leadership in Saudi Arabia. I do think what has fueled its approach is a perception that they face an existential threat from Iran, and that what they see happening, it was not being driven by the Iranian pursuit of nuclear weapons per se. It was being driven, at least their perception of the existential threat was being driven by Iran's coming to dominate and control several different Arab capitals. They see them in control of Baghdad. They see them in control of Damascus. They see them in Yemen. They see them making an effort in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. They see them trying to subvert Bahrain. So they see a kind of effort by Iran to spread its influence and its leverage and in a way that's designed to tighten the noose around Saudi Arabia. And they felt a need to push back. During the Obama administration, they felt that that wasn't happening. And I would have to say, even though I think they like the words of the Trump administration, at this point, they're really not seeing what the Trump administration is doing, other than adopting a tougher rhetorical posture. So in many ways, there's a kind of sense that if they don't act, they're going to find that they are increasingly at the mercy of the Iranians. And so that's why you're seeing a definite effort to push back. I interpret what went on with Rafiq, not with Rafiq, but with Saeed Hariri. I interpret that as an effort to show the Iranians, okay, you want to cause problems? We're not going to allow you to have such easy stability in Lebanon, where Hezbollah gets to control everything without being responsible for everything. We're going to take away that veneer. That's part of a much more competitive approach to dealing with the Iranians.
And Juan, do you see this as working when you look around the Saudi neighborhood?
It's not clear, right? And I think the challenge in Yemen has been the area where the Saudi aggressiveness, certainly led by the Crown Prince when he was defense minister, before he was Crown Prince, has been a very difficult experience, I think, for the Saudis, in part because they haven't been able to impose their will completely. The situation in Yemen is a stalemate. There is a humanitarian disaster, sort of the worst perhaps in the world, other than Syria and maybe some parts of Africa, given the cholera problems, the hunger issues, accusations of human rights violations with some of the bombings. And so this has not gone the way that I think the Saudis have wanted. And in fact, things have escalated. We saw the missile strike over Riyadh that the Saudis actually had to shoot down while they were dealing with the Hariri issue and while they were cracking down on the princes. And so all of these things have converged in some interesting ways, but it's hard to say that it's working. But to Dennis's point, I think the leadership probably thinks they don't have a choice. They don't have a choice because they feel encircled, the way that Dennis so aptly described. They also see Iran with wind in its sails, creating this crescent from ancient Persia through to the Mediterranean without much pushback and without any real sense of what the American plan is, in particular in Syria. What comes next in Syria with American presence and influence? And will that be a point of confrontation with Iran and Iran's allies on the ground? And so those are really important questions for the Saudis. They see it as existential. And they see it after an experience of what they perceive to be abdicated American leadership and a loss of American backing. The Hosni Mubarak experience in Egypt was a fundamental one, I think, in the minds of the Saudis. And frankly, the call by America for countries to take more of their own defense into their own hands is being taken quite literally and quite forcefully by the Saudis. And so I think they're reacting not only to the sense of threat and dread, but also to the realities that they have to take ownership of their own situation.
So let's take a closer look at the U.S.-Saudi relationship under President Trump. President Trump did make Saudi Arabia his first international visit, no small symbol. That was before all the changes that we've seen of the last several months, before Mohammed bin Salman became Crown Prince, before the anti-corruption effort, all that sort of thing. How do you think the relationship has evolved since the president went to Saudi Arabia? Do you think the Saudis are satisfied with the depth of support? Do you think the Americans are welcoming the changes that they see in Saudi Arabia? What do you think is the level of cooperation? Dennis?
Well, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, the rhetorical posture, certainly of the White House, is very supportive of everything that the Saudis seem to be doing, that the King and the Crown Prince are doing. You had the president tweet about how he very much was backing what was being done against those who had been milking the country in Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, you look at the approach on Qatar, it seems to be a divided approach, where the White House seems to send a signal of support to the Saudis in this, and yet the State Department and even the Pentagon seem to have adopted a rather different posture. My guess is that the Saudis like the rhetorical support, because symbolically that's important, But I think they're asking themselves the question, what is the U.S. really prepared to do? I do think Syria is an important focal point of that because they see the Iranians embedding themselves with the Shia militias in Syria, and they see this as part of a spread of Iranian influence and leverage. And they don't see an American strategy for countering that. They've heard the president outline an Iranian policy, the non-certification of, related to the nuclear deal. But at the same time, when the president talks about countering destabilizing Iranian activities in the region, the only thing you see is a continuation of what was done during Obama. You see new designations, the same thing that was done by the Obama administration, which is not bad, but is that the sum total of the policy? And the question is, are we going to act in a way that at a minimum is designed to contain what the Iranians are doing, so that from that standpoint the Saudis can see, okay, the U.S. has an approach, and maybe we should be working really closely with them. And apropos of your question of working closely together, if we were really working closely together, the Saudis would have come to us before they made the decision on Qatar, and we could have had that as a joint policy. Even some of the things regarded to Yemen, they could have come to us beforehand, and we could have come up with a joint approach, including a joint approach for how to apply leverage, but also how to think about how you might use a ceasefire initiative. So there are things we could be doing together if we really had a strategy and a policy. The fact that we're not suggests that the Saudis feel they still have to do these things on their own.
So there are these surprises. I mean, Qatar was a surprise, Hariri was a surprise. It's not as though there is a deep level of cooperation, quiet cooperation.
Right. I think this also follows a pattern with our Sunni Arab allies. You saw Egypt and the UAE acting together without notifying the U.S. in Libya. Again, this followed the pattern of lack of trust in the U.S. The Iran deal, I think, was the final straw. And so I think there is a lot of trust building that has to be recuperated. And I think that was the purpose of the president's first visit to Saudi Arabia, to rebuild that trust, to demonstrate and signal that we understand the relationship, we want the relationship to be strong again. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than Dennis. I think the optics are much better, and the Saudis appreciate that, obviously. There's an attempt to demonstrate with more economic deals, more defense cooperation. I think probably some things happening quietly that are helpful. I think the rhetoric of confrontation is actually very meaningful to the Saudis, that we're willing to confront Iran as opposed to what they saw as an Obama policy that was very forgiving, if not dismissive, of Iranian adventurism and aggressiveness in the region. But Dennis is right that the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in what happens on the ground where it matters most. And this is where I think the Saudis are learning and leading to a certain extent. I think one of their hopes is that in what they do, in what they fashion in terms of policy, they can actually shape American policy as opposed to being led by it. And I think Qatar is a good example of that. I think Lebanon may be another example where what they're trying to do is actually lead their American friends into a policy that frankly may not be comfortable for the United States, but is exactly where the Saudis want to go, and they're hoping that the U.S. will back them. Well, one quick thing, just a point of open disclosure. We talked to everyone in the region. Our firm works with the state of Qatar, the Central Bank of Qatar in particular, on their anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing issues. So I want to make sure that that's clear, and we're open about that.
Thank you for the disclosure. Gentlemen, thank you very much for this incisive look at the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Looking for more in 2018. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول مستقبل سائر النفط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.